They say there are two certainties in life: death and taxes. And since I doubt you want to watch a video about taxes, this video is about death. Specifically, the deaths of famous people. Politicians, musicians, athletes. The type of people who, for better or for worse, have changed the world and deserve to be remembered. If you're old-fashioned like me and still read the newspaper, you might sometimes find yourself on the obituaries page. Usually most of it is filled up with small blurbs about normal people, info about funeral services, and surviving family members. But you can always bet that after a celebrity dies, a large chunk of the page will be reserved to memorialize them. An eloquently written mini-biography that describes this person's life story, their various accomplishments, and so on. It might even include accounts from friends and colleagues. But this person died yesterday. How could they have written such a polished account so quickly? That your rightful skepticism has picked up on is the unsavory secret of obituary writing. Most are written long before the individual in question has passed on. Believe it or not, I would venture that the vast majority of celebrities, even ones younger and healthier than you might feel comfortable with, have fully written obituaries at several of the most prominent newspaper publishers. Death, the news writer's dark bargain goes, is just a matter of time, and it's better to be ready. Now that you know the secret, here is a deeper look into why it happens, how it started, and what it says about our society. Obituaries weren't always these carefully crafted narrative accounts of a person's life. They started out as purely informational. The earliest obituaries were written in stone by the Romans in the Acta Diurna, or Events of the Day, an ancient version of the newspaper established by Julius Caesar in 59 BCE. These obituaries consisted only of the names of notable people who had passed, with no editorial component. They would be posted in public places like the Roman Forum, so that citizens could become informed of the deaths of significant individuals. The Romans were really ahead of their time because obituaries didn't really re-emerge until many hundreds of years later, after the invention of the printing press in 1440. Printing was at first relatively expensive, and so it was reserved for important materials like books and official proclamations that needed to exist for the long term. By 1609, though, as costs came down, the first weekly newspapers emerged in Germany and soon spread throughout Europe. Having such a disposable, quick-turn format allowed for writing about current events. It is impossible to pinpoint who ran the first newspaper obituary, but the earliest ones on record are from the 1750s. Until the 1800s, though, the practice was incredibly rare, with no more than 100 remaining from any given year. The 1852 obituary of Middletown, Connecticut man Ephraim Crowfoot gives a pretty clear example of what these obituaries were like in the early days. Died. In this city on the 24th inst, Ephraim Crowfoot Esquire, aged 51 years. If this seems incredibly curt to you, that's by design. Before 1886, with the invention of the linotype machine, every single letter in a newspaper had to be set by hand. This was a lot of work, so journalists tried to keep it to the bare minimum of detail. Once the setting process was automated, obituaries started to expand. Over the subsequent years, they have remained a fixture in newspapers, though they have undergone dramatic shifts in tone, largely reflective of cultural attitudes at the time. Solemn and respectful Civil War-era obituaries gave way to material, wealth-focused listings of achievements during the Gilded Age. Some writers at the turn of the 20th century must have gotten carried away with the newfound power to write more words, because they wrote a lot about the exact manner of how somebody died, down to every gruesome detail. Soon, though, obituaries started to become more artful, written sometimes even in the form of poems, and using euphemisms for how people died rather than morbid description. In the 1930s, newspapers recognized the obituary section as a profit source, since they could charge a fee for each they published, and they went around standardizing them to the now recognizable 4-part format: death announcement, bio, survived by, funeral information. The last major shift came toward the end of the century, as newspapers started to employ professional writers for the obituary section, and afforded them more editorial freedom than ever before. This led to long-form obituaries like the ones we now see for celebrities. And that pretty much takes us to the present. But there's a lot more to obituaries than just ink on paper. Today, obituaries have become incredibly systematized, even the artful ones. Rather than being written reactively in the hours following a notable person's death, as historically was the case, they are now prepared well in advance. New York Times writer David W. Dunlap, in 2015, revealed some of the details about what goes into running the obituary section at a major paper. The Times, he let spill, maintains over 1,500 obituaries in its reserve, all of them about still living subjects. Writers produce roughly 3 new ones per week, which is just enough to replace the 3 they usually end up needing. They employ the disturbing practice of using the character X as a stand-in for forthcoming details about a person's death. For example, the 2011 obituary for Apple founder Steve Jobs was originally written in 2007 as Stephen P. Jobs, a child of Silicon Valley and a college dropout who reshaped the world's culture around personal computing and digital media, died X at the age of X. The cause of death was X according to X. Research consists of poring through historical archives, as well as interviewing those close to the subject, which raises the curious celebrity etiquette question of what you should do after providing a quote for use in a friend's future obituary. Do you keep it to yourself in order to not freak the person out? Or do you talk about it openly? I'm sure there are some who would feel honored and see the fact there are advanced obituaries out there for them as kind of cool. After the initial draft, work is far from done. Writers return to their obituaries on a yearly basis, updating the account with new details and perhaps tweaking the tone to account for shifts in public perception. Due to this practice of writing obituaries ahead of time, we sometimes see the bizarre phenomenon of an obituary's subject outliving its writer, a commemoration of the deceased written by the deceased. One thing Dunlap's interview does not explain is exactly how the writers decide who to pre-write obituaries for. It's likely some combination of age, health status, and the person's perceived importance. Maybe there's some rigorous mathematical formula for making the decision. Think of it like a life insurance score, but for use by journalists. However these decisions are made, when the time does come and someone from the stockpile passes on, it's as simple as locating the obituary and bringing it to publication. But what does it say about our culture that we put so much stock into preparing obituaries ahead of time? For one, it must say that we like reading them. Obituaries are different than typical descriptive journalistic articles, those neutral, factual accounts of a bill being passed in Congress or the response to a natural disaster. They contain a subjective, evaluative voice, but also one with a deal of authority. And they become part of the historical record, providing almost a verdict on the worthiness of an individual to be remembered. Just the editorial choice to run a person's obituary says that they have made a significant impact. But it is only in the words themselves that readers learn why that is the case. As such, the journalist him or herself has a huge influence in shaping public perceptions. But we shouldn't stray too far from the real question here. Is writing an account of a human being's death while they are still living really a good thing? In doing so, are we rushing the mourning process, missing out on some crucial reflection that can only occur in hindsight. The counterpoint here has merit. However, whether we like it or not, the story of how we are remembered is one that is always being written in the minds of those around us, regardless of whether some journalist puts it down to paper. We shouldn't expect the obituary to be something it's not. No matter how much advanced planning and research has gone in, it remains but a momentary reflection on a life that likely spanned many decades. It's impossible to whittle down such a sprawling story to just a few paragraphs, no matter how tightly written. And how we remember famous figures can and will change over time. I think there's a good case that we should just enjoy the obituary for what it is. An imperfect but comforting art form. A reliable ritual for remembering those we have lost.